Clara Keene did not cry when her husband left her. She stood in the middle of Main Street, Copper Creek, Arizona, in the dead heat of summer. Divorce papers in one hand, a land deed in the other, and she watched Thomas Cooper ride away with another woman's laughter trailing behind him like smoke in the wind. She didn't beg. She didn't break. She just watched him go. And something deep inside her turned to iron. If this story speaks to something in your heart, subscribe, stay until the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story can travel. The summer of 1882 came to Copper Creek, Arizona, like a punishment. The sun didn't ease into the day, it arrived hard and without mercy, baking the packed dirt of Main Street into something that cracked underfoot. By 7 in the morning, the air already tasted like iron and ash. By 9, the heat shimmered off every roof and wagon wheel in town, warping the world at its edges, making everything look slightly unreal. Clara Keene had been awake since before the sun rose. She'd heard Thomas moving through the house in the dark, the slow, deliberate sounds of a man who had already made his decision and was simply finishing the paperwork of it. Drawers opening, the leather of a saddlebag, boots on the floorboards. She lay still on her side of the bed and listened to every single sound with her eyes open, staring at the wall, and she did not make a noise. She had known for 2 weeks, maybe longer if she was being honest with herself and Clara Keene. Whatever else she was, had always been a woman who eventually forced herself to be honest. She heard him pause in the doorway. She didn't turn around. Clara. His voice was quiet. Not guilty enough. Not guilty nearly enough. Go, she said. I think we ought to... Thomas. She kept her voice flat and even the way you speak to a horse that's about to bolt. I said go. A long silence. Then the sound of his boots moving away from the door. And then. And this was the part she had not let herself think about, the part she had not prepared for. She heard a second set of footsteps in the yard. Lighter, quicker, and a woman's voice low and warm saying his name. Clara was out of bed before she had decided to move. She dressed in 60 seconds flat. She didn't look in the mirror. She picked up the 2 documents from the top of the bureau, the divorce papers she'd signed 3 days ago when the lawyer rode out from Tucson, and the deed to the homestead, the one with her name on it, the one Thomas had not bothered to contest, because he'd assumed it didn't matter, and she walked out the front door. Thomas was already leading his horse toward the road. The woman was beside him, one hand on his arm. Young. Clara noted this the way you note the weather. Young, dark-haired, wearing a blue dress that was too pretty for the occasion and not nearly practical enough for the territory. Thomas saw Clara come out of the house and he stopped walking. The young woman looked at Clara, then at Thomas, then back at Clara. Something flickered across her face that wasn't quite shame, but was in the same neighborhood. Clara walked straight up to Thomas and stopped 2 feet from him. She looked him in the eye. The deed, she said, is in my name. The homestead is mine. If you or your lawyer or anyone else tries to tell a different story about that, I will walk into every courtroom in the Arizona territory with this paper, and I will make that story very short. Thomas's jaw tightened. Clara, I'm not here to fight you about the land. You're not here for anything anymore, she said. That's rather the point. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away first. Clara stood and watched him ride out. She stood until the dust settled, until the last echo of hooves faded into the white morning heat, until Copper Creek, Arizona went quiet again around her. Then she tucked the deed into her dress pocket, turned on her heel, and walked toward town. Main Street was already busy when Clara arrived. She felt the shift the moment she stepped onto the boardwalk. Conversations that had been moving at a normal pace slowed. Heads turned in that careful sideways way people use when they want to look but don't want to be caught at it. 2 women near the dry goods store leaned together and murmured something behind their hands. Clara kept her chin up and her stride even. Her first stop was Harding's General Store, where she'd been a customer for 6 years. Walt Harding was behind the counter, a heavy-set man with a red face, and the look of someone who'd already heard the news. "Morning, Walt," Clara said. "I'm looking for work. I can manage accounts, stock shelves, serve customers. You've seen how I handle myself." Walt Harding's eyes went to the window, then back to Clara. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Clara, I think you're a fine woman. I do, but with everything going on, I just don't think it wouldn't sit right with some of the regular customers, you being with your situation being what it is." "My situation," Clara said carefully, "is that I'm a woman who needs employment. That's a very ordinary situation, Walt." "I know it is. I know. I just can't. I'm sorry." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked out. The barber shop, the feed store, the seamstress on the corner of 2nd and Mill, a woman named Doris Pratt, who'd known Clara since she first arrived in Copper Creek as a young bride, and who now couldn't quite meet her eyes. "It's not that I don't think well of you, honey," Doris said, fidgeting with a spool of thread. "It's just Thomas came in yesterday before he said some things." Clara went very still. "What things?" Doris's hands stopped moving. He said you'd been difficult. That you were unstable was the word he used. He said the homestead work had done something to your nerves and that you'd been acting—" She trailed off. "I'm just telling you what he said, Clara. I don't necessarily—" "What else did he say?" "He said anyone who gave you credit or work would likely end up on the losing end of it." Doris finally looked up, and there was something that might have been apology in her face. "He came in talking to people yesterday afternoon. Several people. He was—" She shook her head. "He was thorough about it." The morning heat felt different now, sharper, more pointed. Clara said, "Thank you, Doris." She walked out of the seamstress shop and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, the sun pressing down on her shoulders like a hand. She breathed in slowly through her nose and out through her mouth, and she did not let herself think about all of it at once. She took it in pieces. Thomas had left. Thomas had left with another woman. Thomas, before he left, had spent the afternoon before his departure systematically walking through every business establishment in Copper Creek and poisoning the well behind him. He hadn't just left her. He had made sure to leave her with nothing to grab onto. Clara put her hand in her pocket and felt the edges of the land deed. She pressed her thumb against the corner of it until it was almost painful. She walked to the bank. Randolph Miles, the bank manager, was a thin man who wore his authority like a coat that was slightly too large for him. He received Clara in his office with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had already decided something and was preparing to explain it in the least confrontational way possible. "Mrs. Keene," he began. "Miss Keene," she said, "or Clara, whichever you prefer." "Yes, well." He shuffled papers. "About the account. The account is in my name. It is, yes, however. Then I'd like to know the balance, and I'd like to know what my options are regarding a small operating loan to carry me through the harvest season." Miles cleared his throat. "The balance is $47 and some change. Regarding a loan." He hesitated. "I have to be honest with you, Miss Keene. A woman operating a homestead without a male, the law," Clara said, "permits it. The law permits many things that aren't always practical." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I've had a conversation with Thomas Keene Cooper, with your former husband just recently, and he expressed some concern about the viability of the property. He suggested that there may be a legal question about certain improvements made to the land during the marriage which might affect." Clara stood up. Miles blinked. "Miss Keene, I want you to listen to me very carefully, Mr. Miles," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "I have a deed to that land with my name on it. I have $47 and whatever change. And I have 2 hands and a working knowledge of how to run a homestead because I have been doing it largely alone for the past 3 years while Thomas Cooper concerned himself with other matters." She picked up her bag. "I don't need your loan. I'll find another way. But I want you to know that I heard every word you just said, and I'm going to remember it." She walked out of this bank into the white heat of noon. She sat on the edge of the water trough at the far end of Main Street, in the narrow strip of shade thrown by the overhang of the saddle shop, and she let herself have 5 minutes. Just 5. She thought about the vegetable garden that needed to be harvested. The fence along the north pasture that had 2 rotted posts she'd been meaning to replace for a month. The chickens, the small herd of cattle, the winter wheat she'd planted in the spring that was going to need tending in 6 weeks. She thought about $47, which was not nothing, but was also not enough. She thought about Thomas Cooper walking through Copper Creek the day before, door to door, methodical and smiling, building a wall of doubt around her before he left, so that when she went looking for help, she'd find nothing but brick. She sat with all of that for 5 minutes. Then she stood up. "That's a hard look you've got there, ma'am." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, with the particular cadence of a man who was accustomed to open spaces and didn't feel the need to fill them with noise. Clara turned. He was standing at the hitching post beside the saddle shop, tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years under a western sun. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he was holding the reins of a dark bay horse with the ease of a man who'd been holding horses his whole life. He wasn't looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she noticed. He was looking at her the way you look at something you find genuinely interesting. "I beg your pardon?" Clara said. "Didn't mean to intrude." He tipped his hat. "Kieran Thompson. I've got a spread about 4 miles east of town." Clara Keene. Something moved through his expression, recognition maybe, but not the gossipy kind. "You're the one with the homestead off the creek road." "I am." "Good piece of land," he said. "I've ridden past it. Somebody's been working it hard." "That somebody is me," Clara said. He nodded. "I figured." A pause. The heat pressed down around them. Somewhere down the street a door banged open, and 2 men's voices rose briefly and then subsided. "I heard you were going around looking for work," Kieran said. He wasn't apologetic about it. He just said it plainly, like a fact. "Word travels fast in Copper Creek." "It does." He rubbed the side of his jaw with his free hand. "I could use help with accounts. I'm no good with numbers. I've got more cattle than I can keep track of, and my ledger looks like a man fell into it face first." Clara looked at him steadily. "Is this charity, Mr. Thompson?" "No, ma'am," he said without missing a beat. "It's a business arrangement. You'd be doing me a genuine service." "You don't know anything about my ability with numbers." "No," he agreed. "But I know you've been running a homestead operation on your own for some time, and a woman who can do that can read a ledger." He paused. "You can say no. I won't take offense." Clara studied him. He held her gaze without flinching and without the particular quality of pressure that men sometimes used when they wanted something, that leaning quality, that sense of the ask already being inside the air between you. There was none of that. He was simply standing there, offering something he'd decided to offer, apparently genuinely prepared to accept whatever answer she gave. She said, "I don't need anyone to ride in and solve my problems, Mr. Thompson." "I know that," he said. "And I don't intend to be beholden to anyone in this town or out of it." "I understand." "Good." She picked up her bag. "Then I'll thank you for the offer and tell you I'll manage on my own." He nodded. "All right." He gathered his horse's reins and made to move on, and then he paused and looked back at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't listen to what Cooper said about you yesterday when he came around. He said it simply the way he seemed to say everything. I had some business in town. I heard him. Thought you ought to know there was at least one person who didn't take it as gospel." Clara went very still. Kieran Thompson put his hat back on his head, tipped it once, and walked his horse down the street. She went home. She went home, and she walked every inch of that land, the 40-acre homestead that had her name on a piece of paper in her pocket. She walked the north fence line and counted the rotted posts. There were 4, not 2. She'd been optimistic. She walked the garden rows and calculated what was ready to harvest, and what needed another 2 weeks, and what had been overtaken by the summer heat and was simply gone. She stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at her 6 cattle and her 2 horses and the 16 chickens roosting in the corner, and she did the arithmetic in her head. What she could sell. What she needed to keep. How far $47 could stretch if she was ruthless about it. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Her kitchen table in her house on her land, and she opened the ledger she kept for the homestead, and she turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "What I have." And then she listed everything. Every post, every animal, every row of vegetables, every tool in the shed, every jar of preserved goods on the cellar shelf. She wrote it all down because a thing written down becomes real in a different way than a thing only held in the mind. A thing written down can be counted. She worked until the sun went down and the heat finally grudgingly pulled back an inch or 2 from the world. When she was done, she sat in the dark for a while. Thomas had been thorough. She gave him that. He had walked through Copper Creek like a man closing accounts, spending his last hours in the territory, making sure that when she came looking for help, there would be none to find. It was a particular kind of cruelty, not hot, not explosive, but cold and careful and assembled in advance. The kind of cruelty that took planning. She thought about what Kieran Thompson had said. I didn't listen. She thought about the way he'd said it. Not like a man offering himself as a hero. Like a man stating a fact he thought she deserved to know. Clara closed her ledger and pressed her palms flat on the table. She thought about her mother, who had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children in Missouri with a vegetable garden and sheer will. Who used to say that the worst thing that could happen to a woman wasn't hardship. Hardship you could work through. The worst thing was letting hardship convince you that you were less than what you were. She thought about that for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil and opened the ledger again to a second fresh page. At the top of this one she wrote, "What I'm going to do." And she began. The summer night hummed around her. Out in the dark, something a coyote maybe called once and went quiet. Copper Creek was 3 miles away, and right now it felt like 300. The land was still, and the air had finally cooled to something bearable, and Clara Keene sat at her kitchen table with a pencil and a plan, and she was not beaten. She was not beaten. She was just beginning. Clara was up before sunrise the next morning. She didn't sleep much, maybe 3 hours, maybe less. But lying in bed waiting for the light felt like surrender. And surrender was the one thing she had decided sitting at that kitchen table with her pencil and her ledger she was not going to do. So she got up. She put the coffee on. She pulled on her work boots and walked out to the barn, while the sky was still that deep bruised purple that comes before dawn in the Arizona desert, and she got to work. The cattle needed feeding. The chickens needed letting out. The north fence needed patching before she lost any animals to the open scrubland beyond it, and she had 4 rotted posts, and the better part of a day's hard labor standing between her and that being fixed. She worked through the coolest part of the morning with the focused, deliberate pace of a woman who has learned that panic is just wasted energy wearing a dramatic costume. She didn't think about Thomas. She didn't think about Randolph Miles at the bank, or Walt Harding at the general store, or Doris Pratt with her spool of thread and her apologetic eyes. She thought about posts and wire and the angle of the morning light and the list she'd made the night before. She was 3 posts deep into the fence line when she heard the horse. She didn't stop working. She drove the new post into the softened earth with 3 more strikes of the mallet set. It tested it with both hands, and then she straightened up and turned around. Kieran Thompson was sitting on his bay horse at the edge of her property line, 10 yards off, watching her. He wasn't moving toward her. He wasn't calling out. He was just sitting there, hat pushed back on his head, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn, watching her work with the particular expression of a man who has seen something that surprises him and is taking a moment to absorb it. "Mr. Thompson," Clara said. "Miss Keene." He swung down from the horse and held the reins loosely at his side. "I'm not here to argue with yesterday's answer." "Then what are you here for?" He reached into his saddlebag and produced a paper-wrapped parcel. "Brought some wire. Heard you were working the north fence." He paused. "From the road. I could see the line from the road." Clara looked at the parcel, then at him. "I didn't ask for wire." "No. he said. You didn't. He set the parcel on the ground without ceremony, like he was setting down something he'd already stopped being attached to. You can send it back with me, or you can use it. Either way, I'm not carrying it home. She stared at him for a long moment. The morning was warming fast the way it did in June in the territory. Not gradually, but in sudden steps, the temperature climbing like it was taking stairs 2 at a time. You make a habit of bringing supplies to women who've already said no to you, she asked. First time actually? He didn't smile, but something in his face shifted slightly in the direction of it. I find I'm improvising, despite herself, despite the exhaustion and the anger and the $47 sitting in the Copper Creek bank that she was already calculating the uses for, down to the cent. Despite all of it, Clara felt something loosen infinitesimally in her chest. Not trust, not even close to trust, but something like recognition. The recognition of a man who was operating without an agenda. She could immediately identify which in her experience was rarer than wire fencing and considerably more valuable. I'll use the wire, she said. I'll put $4 toward it. That's what it costs at Harding's. $2.50, Kieran said. You overpaid at Harding's. Then $2.50. He nodded. He made no move to help with the fence, and she made no move to invite him to. He walked his horse to the post she'd just set, looped the reins around it, and sat down in the dry grass with his back against the wood and his hat over his face. Clara looked at him. Are you going to sleep on my fence post? She said. Taking a rest, he said from under the hat. Had an early morning. Clara picked up the wire. She worked. He rested. And somehow bizarrely, with this stranger's large, quiet presence 10 feet away, the work went faster. He was gone when she finished the last post. She didn't hear him leave. One moment the horse was there, and then, when she walked back to collect her tools, she was alone. He'd left the extra wire neatly coiled by the first post. She stared at it for a moment, then picked it up and put it in the barn. She washed up at the pump and walked inside, and that was when she found the note that had been slid under the front door. It wasn't from Kieran Thompson. The handwriting was Thomas's. She'd know it anywhere. That particular upward slant he'd always had. Too careful, too deliberate, the handwriting of a man who was always performing even when no one was watching. The note was 3 lines. Clara, I've engaged Mr. Garfield Rutherford in Tucson regarding the marital property question. He believes there is a case to be made for shared improvements. You'll be hearing from him. Clara read it twice. Then she set it on the table very carefully, and she stood with her hands flat on the table, and she breathed. Garfield Rutherford. She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. He was a land lawyer out of Tucson who had built a career on finding the seams in deeds and property titles and prying them open, who had made men rich and left women with nothing on more than one occasion. He didn't take cases he expected to lose. He was expensive, and he was brutal, and he was very, very good. Thomas hadn't just left. He hadn't just poisoned the town. He had gone and loaded a gun and pointed it directly at the one thing she had left. The land. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with a kind of detached interest, the way you notice weather. She pressed them harder against the table until they stopped. She needed a lawyer. She had $47 minus $2.50 for the wire. $44.50. A lawyer cost money she did not have. She picked up Thomas's note and folded it once and put it in her pocket with the land deed, and she put on her good hat and she walked back to town. The law office of George Pruitt sat above the post office up a narrow staircase that smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco. Pruitt himself was 60, slow-moving, with a face like something carved out of driftwood, weathered down to the essential grain of things. He'd been practicing law in Copper Creek since before it was properly a town, and he had the reputation of a man who was unimpressed by most things he'd seen and had seen most things. He read Thomas's note without expression. Garfield Rutherford, he said. Yes? Clara said. He set the note down and looked at it for a moment. You know what he'll argue? The improvements. The fence, the well we dug, in the second year the barn extension. Any of those put in before your name was on the deed? No. My name was on the deed from the day we took possession. I made sure of it. Clara's voice was steady. She had rehearsed steadiness on the walk into town. Thomas signed off on that arrangement himself. He didn't want the liability of the property taxes if the first year went badly. Pruitt picked up the note again, turned it over, put it down. Rutherford will find an angle. He always does. What he'll likely argue is that Thomas's labor contribution to those improvements constitutes a form of shared investment that entitles him to a portion of the property's value. His labor contribution, Clara said flatly. He was in town 4 nights out of 7. I built that fence line. I dug that well with Hector Vargas, who I paid $3 a day to help me. I have receipts. Pruitt looked up at her properly for the first time. You have receipts. I keep records, Clara said. I have a ledger with every expenditure since we took possession of that property dated and itemized. I have payment receipts for every piece of labor I contracted. I have the original deed with both our signatures and the notarization. A pause. Pruitt looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and something more like respect. Well, he said, what are my chances? With that documentation. He rocked back in his chair. Better than most in your position. Rutherford's going to have a hard time arguing shared investment when you can show independent documented expenditure. He picked up his pen. I'll take the case. My rate is $8 to open the file and $15 if it goes to hearing. Clara's stomach didn't drop. She'd already done the math on the way over. I can give you the 8 now, she said. The 15. We'll wait, Pruitt said, with the brisk manner of a man who had already decided. I've known Thomas Cooper for 4 years, and I've thought somewhat less of him with each passing one. Consider it a personal investment. Clara reached into her bag and counted $8 onto his desk. It was more than a third of everything she had. Her hand was completely steady. Thank you, Mr. Pruitt, she said. She stood to leave. She was almost at the door when Pruitt spoke again. Miss Keene, she turned. Rutherford will try to talk to your neighbors, to anyone who works adjacent to your property. He'll be looking for witnesses who can speak to Thomas's presence on the land, his contributions, his investment of effort. He said it carefully. You might want to think about who knows your land well enough to speak to what actually happened out there. Clara thought about Kieran Thompson sitting against her fence post with his hat over his face. I might have someone, she said. Cowboy. She found him at the feed store, not because she'd been looking for him specifically. She told herself this and mostly believed it. She had business at the feed store. She needed to price out what it would cost to supplement the cattle's grazing through the rest of the summer. She just happened to find him there, standing at the counter in conversation with old Pete Dunmore, who ran the place, discussing something about hay prices with the unhurried authority of a man who bought a great deal of hay. Kieran saw her come in and nodded. Not the exaggerated greeting of a man trying to signal something, just a nod. The way you acknowledge someone you've met. Miss Keene. Mr. Thompson. She addressed Pete Dunmore first. Got her pricing, wrote the numbers in her small notebook, and tucked it away. Then she turned to Kieran. Have you got a minute? He stepped away from the counter. She told him quickly and without embellishment about Rutherford and Pruitt and what Pruitt had said about witnesses. She watched his face as she spoke. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most men managed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You want me to tell a lawyer what I've seen of your operation, he said. What you've observed, if it's consistent with a woman independently managing a property. If you've ridden past enough times to have a genuine sense of it. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to say anything that isn't true. I've ridden past your property near every morning for 2 years, Kieran said. I've seen you out there before the sun was up and after it went down. I've never once seen Thomas Cooper working that land. He paused. I'll talk to Pruitt. Clara felt something loosen in her chest for the second time that day. It was a dangerous feeling. She didn't trust it. I appreciate that, she said. I want you to know it's the only thing I'm asking for. I know it is. He studied her for a moment. You're not going to make any of this easy, are you? Easy for whom? For yourself, he said simply. You'd rather fight this whole town on your own than let anyone stand beside you. It landed harder than she expected. She kept her face even. I don't know you well enough to let you stand beside me, Mr. Thompson. No, he agreed. You don't. He picked up his hat from the counter and put it on. Good thing I'm patient. He walked out of the feed store, and Clara stood for a moment, looking at the door he'd gone through. Pete Dunmore was very busy rearranging something behind the counter. Don't say a word, Pete, Clara said. Wasn't going to say a thing, Pete said, in the voice of a man saying a great deal. The letter from Rutherford's office arrived 4 days later. It was formal and precise and written in the language of men who had learned that power sounds more powerful when it uses the fewest dramatic words possible. It informed her that Mr. Garfield Rutherford, acting on behalf of Mr. Thomas Cooper, was initiating proceedings to establish a claim of shared marital improvement to the property located at, and here her address, her land, her 40 acres, and that she would be expected to appear before a county judge in Tucson in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Clara set the letter on top of Thomas's note and looked at both of them. Then Margaret Hale knocked on her door. Margaret was 62, sharp-eyed, and had been running the boarding house at the end of 2nd Street for 30 years. She and Clara had been friends in the quiet, practical way that women in small frontier towns become friends, not through long, confiding conversations, but through the accumulation of small reliabilities. Margaret had always been there when Clara needed something. Clara had always found a way to return the favor. Margaret did not wait to be invited in. She walked through the door with a basket on one arm and the look of a woman who had made a decision. Sit down, she said. Margaret. Sit down, Clara Keene, and let me talk. Clara sat. Margaret set the basket on the table, bread, some preserves, a small paper sack that turned out to contain coffee, and she pulled out a chair and sat across from her. She looked at the letter and Thomas's note lying on the table between them. I heard about Rutherford, Margaret said. Word travels. It does. Margaret folded her hands. I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it, and not just sit there nodding the way you do when you've already decided not to take advice. She fixed Clara with a look. You have friends in this town. Not everyone listened to Thomas Cooper. Not everyone is going to let him waltz back in here and strip you of that land without saying something about it. Clara was quiet. I know 6 women who'll vouch for your character in court if Pruitt thinks it'll help, Margaret continued. I know that Hector Vargas kept a record of the days he worked for you because he's a careful man. And I know, she paused, that there are people in this town who are watching what happens to you and thinking about what it means for all of us. Clara looked at her across the table. There was something pressing at the back of her throat that she was not going to allow. She swallowed it. I don't know how to do this, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. What? Let people help. She looked at her hands. It feels like every time someone offers something, I'm just waiting to find out what it's going to cost. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Thomas did that, she said simply. That's not you. That's something he put in you. The words hit Clara somewhere deep and undefended. She sat very still. You are going to win this, Margaret said. Her voice had the weight of a woman who had outlasted a great deal. But you need to let the people who are on your side be on your side, Clara. You cannot do it alone. Nobody can. And trying to is not strength. It's just loneliness, wearing pride as a coat. Clara looked at the letter from Rutherford's office. 6 weeks. She looked at Thomas's note. She looked at the list in her ledger, what she was going to do. She looked at Margaret Hale's steady, certain face across the table. All right, Clara said. It was only 2 words. But they were the 2 hardest words she'd said in recent memory. And when she said them, something shifted, not in the room, but somewhere inside her. in the place where she'd been holding herself rigid and alone since the moment she'd heard Thomas's boots on the floor in the dark. "All right," she said again. "Tell me who's with me." Margaret reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. "More than you know," she said. "More than Thomas Cooper counted on." Outside, the summer heat pressed against the windows, and the wind moved through the dry grass along the creek road, and the Arizona sky burned its usual merciless blue. 6 weeks until Tucson. 6 weeks until Garfield Rutherford stood up in front of a judge and tried to take the only thing Thomas Cooper had not been able to take when he left the ground beneath her feet, the land with her name on it, the 40 acres she had worked and tended and bled over and made into something real. 6 weeks. Clara thought about Kieran Thompson at the feed store. Good thing I'm patient. She thought about her mother in Missouri, pressing on through 2 hard winters with 4 children and nothing but will. She turned her hand over under Margaret's and held on. She was not alone. She was going to have to learn all over again, against every instinct Thomas Cooper had spent years building in her, how not to be alone. It might be the hardest thing she had ever done. She intended to do it anyway. The weeks between Margaret's visit and the Tucson hearing moved like water over stone, fast on the surface, grinding underneath. Clara worked the homestead with a precision that bordered on fury. She was up before the sun every morning and in bed after dark every night, and every hour in between was accounted for. The vegetable harvest went into jars in the cellar. The cattle were fed and counted and fed again. She repaired the barn roof where 2 boards had warped over the winter, hauling herself up there alone on a ladder in the July heat and nailing new wood with the focused violence of a woman who needed something to hit. She sold 4 of her 6 cattle to a buyer passing through from New Mexico, kept the 2 she needed for the property, let the others go, and banked the money with Pruitt directly so it couldn't be touched. She met with Pruitt twice a week. She brought her ledger every time. She sat across from him in that office that smelled like pipe tobacco, and she answered every question he put to her with the documents to back it up, and she watched him grow quieter and more confident with each meeting in the way that lawyers do when they believe they're holding something solid. "Rutherford is good," Pruitt told her on the 3rd meeting, "but you're better documented than any woman I've represented in 30 years. You kept receipts for everything." "I always knew Thomas might try something," Clara said simply. Pruitt looked at her over his glasses. "You planned for this." "I planned for the possibility." She corrected him, not unkindly. "When a man tells you what kind of man he is, you pay attention. Thomas told me early." Kieran Thompson came to the property 3 times in those weeks, and each time it was on some pretext that was thin enough to see through, but delivered with such straightforward sincerity that Clara found herself unable to object to it in good conscience. Once it was to return a tool she'd left at the feed store, which she didn't entirely believe she'd left there. Once it was because he said he'd spotted one of her cattle near the south boundary, which turned out to be true. The 3rd time, he simply arrived with a length of lumber she hadn't asked for, and the calm demeanor of a man who had weighed the situation and made a practical decision. "I didn't order lumber," she said. "I know." He set it against the barn wall. "That section's going to go before winter. I figured you had enough to think about without adding it to the list." Clara looked at the lumber. She looked at him. "Kieran." It was the first time she'd used his first name, and they both heard it. He went very still in a way that wasn't tension, exactly more like a man trying not to startle something. "You don't have to keep finding reasons to come here," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know that too." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, which was the problem. It was far too comfortable. Clara felt it, and she didn't trust it, and she was honest enough with herself to know that the not trusting was more about her own history than anything he'd done. "The hearing is in 3 weeks, she said. "I know. I need my head to be clear. It will be." He said it without hesitation, like a statement of fact about something he'd already observed. "You've had a clear head every day since this started. I don't think it's likely to stop now." She looked at him for a moment. "Are you always this certain about people you barely know?" "No," he said. Just some of them. He picked up his hat from the barn rail where he'd set it. I'll be at Pruitt's on Thursday like we arranged. I've got everything I need to say thought through. He put his hat on, nodded once, and left. Clara stood in the barn door and watched him ride out. And then she turned back to the lumber and ran her hand along the grain of it and thought about a man who noticed which walls were going to give before they gave. It was a dangerous thing to notice. She noticed it anyway. Thomas came back on a Tuesday. She didn't hear about it from Thomas. She heard about it from Pete Dunmore at the feed store, who heard it from the livery boy who'd taken Thomas's horse when he rode in late Monday evening and checked into the hotel on Main Street. Not Mildred's boarding house, which is where he'd always stayed when he was in town on business before, but the hotel, the good one, the one that charged twice as much and served whiskey until midnight. The detail mattered. The hotel was where men stayed when they wanted to be seen as having resources. Clara absorbed this information on Tuesday morning and spent approximately 90 seconds feeling afraid, and then she stopped. She went to Pruitt. "He's not supposed to approach you directly," Pruitt said when she told him. "His lawyer knows better than to allow that. If he tries—" "He'll try," Clara said. "Thomas doesn't take instruction well when he thinks he's already won something. He hasn't won anything. He doesn't know that yet." She looked at Pruitt's desk. What would he be doing here? The hearing's in Tucson. His lawyer is in Tucson. What does he gain by coming to Copper Creek? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He could be looking for witnesses, people who'll testify to his presence on the property, his contributions. We've already accounted for that. He could be trying to rattle you. He's welcome to try. He could be... Pruitt paused, and the pause was longer than the others. "Clara, there's something I should tell you. I heard this morning from Rutherford's office. They've filed an amended claim." She went still. "What kind of amendment?" Pruitt opened his desk drawer and removed a document she hadn't seen before. "They're no longer arguing only shared improvements. Rutherford is now claiming that the deed itself may be invalid, that the original transfer was executed under duress, and that Thomas's signature on the property arrangement was obtained through, and I'm quoting here, undue influence and misrepresentation by the other party." The room was quiet. Clara heard her own heartbeat very clearly for a moment. "He's saying I manipulated him into putting the land in my name," she said. "Yes?" "He's saying I committed fraud." "He's saying a version of that, yes. Rutherford will dress it in more careful language." Pruitt set the document down. "This is a more aggressive play than I expected. It changes the complexity of our position." "Can he make it stick?" "Not with the documentation you have, but it complicates things. A fraud allegation, even a weak one, is the kind of claim that makes judges cautious. It creates uncertainty, and in property disputes, uncertainty tends to favor the party with more resources," Clara said. "It can." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "He came back to find something he can use to make the fraud story look credible. Some witness, some document, something." She looked up. "What could he be looking for?" Pruitt met her eyes. "Someone who might say that you pushed hard for the property arrangement, that you insisted on it against his preferences. Someone who was there at the beginning, who might remember the conversations leading up to the deed," Clara thought. She went back 5 years in her mind to the week they took possession of the land. Who had been there? Who had been present for the conversations about the deed arrangement? The lawyer who'd notarized it had retired and moved to California. The neighbors at the time had mostly moved on. The one person who had been consistently present, who had helped them move in, who had sat at their table the week they signed the papers. She closed her eyes briefly. "Owen Pruitt," she said. George Pruitt looked at her sharply. "My brother. He was there. He helped us carry furniture. He was at the table the evening we talked about the property arrangement because you asked him to witness a separate document, and he stayed for dinner." She kept her voice level. "Owen and Thomas used to drink together, before Thomas left." The office was very quiet. "My brother," Pruitt said slowly, "would not lie for Thomas Cooper." "No," Clara said carefully. But he might remember things in a way that's shaped by whoever talked to him most recently. Pruitt's jaw tightened. He stood up. "I need to make a visit," he said. And she was halfway back to the homestead when she heard her name. She turned. Thomas was standing in the middle of the road behind her, in good clothes, freshly pressed with the look he always wore when he thought he had an advantage, that particular ease, like a man who's already done the difficult calculation and arrived at a comfortable answer. "I think we should talk," he said. "We have lawyers for that," Clara said. She kept walking. "Clara." His voice shifted, dropped into something that had once been familiar, something that had once made her stop. "I don't want this to go badly for you. That's not what I want." She stopped. Not because his voice moved her. She stopped because she had made a decision back in the 5 minutes she'd given herself sitting at the water trough not to be the kind of woman who ran from conversations she needed to have. She turned around. She walked back to him until she was close enough that he couldn't pretend this was anything other than what it was, and she looked him in the eye. "What do you want, Thomas?" "A settlement," he said. 20 acres. The western section along the creek. I take that you keep the rest. No hearing, no Rutherford, no judge. Clean and done." "No." He blinked. He'd expected something else, hesitation at least. "Clara." "No," she said again. "That land is mine, every acre of it. I have the documentation to prove it, and I have a lawyer who believes me, and I have witnesses who'll stand up and say what they saw. You have an amended fraud claim that you and Garfield Rutherford invented because you realized your original argument was going to fail." She held his gaze. "So no, I'm not settling. I'm not giving you 1 square foot." Something moved through Thomas's face. The ease fell away. Underneath it was something uglier. Not grief, not guilt, but the specific frustration of a man who has designed something carefully and found it isn't working the way he intended. "You think that cowboy's going to save you," he said. The words came out with an edge that hadn't been there a moment before. Clara went very still. "I beg your pardon." "Thompson." Thomas's mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. "You think I don't know he's been out at your place? You think this town doesn't talk?" He took a step closer. "How's that going to look in front of a judge? Clara, woman living alone. Man coming around, no chaperone. You want to add that to the story we're already telling about your judgment." The words were designed to shame. She felt them land, felt the old familiar pressure of them, the way Thomas had always known exactly which angle to use, which particular wound to press. He'd spent 7 years learning her, and he was using that knowledge now like a tool. She let the words land. She felt them. And then she said very quietly, "Get away from me, Thomas. I'm trying to help you. You are standing in the public road threatening a woman with her reputation because you can't win a legal argument on its merits." Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised, and then she wasn't. "I'm going to walk away from you now. If you follow me or approach me again, I'll have Pruitt file a harassment complaint, and I'll describe this exact conversation to the judge in Tucson in front of everyone in that courtroom." Thomas stared at her. "You've changed," he said. And the way he said it, it wasn't quite a compliment, and it wasn't quite an accusation. It was the tone of a man who has underestimated something and is only now adjusting the estimate. "I found out what I was made of," Clara said. "Turns out I had you to thank for that." She turned and walked away from him, and this time she kept walking. She told Kieran that evening. He'd come to drop off some documents. Pruitt needed courier work, he called it, though she was aware it was more than that. He stood in her kitchen and listened to everything she'd said to Thomas on the road, and his face went through several things she watched carefully. A tightening around the jaw when she described Thomas's words about reputation, a stillness when she got to the part about what Thomas had said about him specifically. "He mentioned me," Kieran said. "He did." Trying to make it look like something it isn't. "Yes." Kieran was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does it bother you that he said it?" Clara considered the question honestly. "It bothers me that he said it in that tone," she said. "It doesn't bother me that you've been here. Because I know what you've been here for. He looked at her. Do you? The kitchen was quiet. The evening had that particular weight to it, warm close, the sound of the land outside going still as the sun went down. I think so, Clara said carefully. And it was one word. Simple. Direct. The way he did everything. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who had brought wire and lumber and his own steady presence, without ever once making her feel like she owed him something for it. And she felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the legal case, or the 40 acres, or Garfield Rutherford. And I think, she started. The sound of a horse coming fast up the road cut through the evening quiet. Both of them turned. Kieran moved to the door first, and Clara was a step behind him when they saw it was Pete Dunmore's boy riding hard, and his face had that particular wild-eyed look of someone carrying news that can't wait. He pulled up at the porch steps and said, breathing hard, Miss Keene, Mr. Pruitt says you need to come to town. Tonight. He gulped air. Thomas Cooper went to Owen Pruitt this afternoon. Owen signed something. The ground shifted again. This time the way ground shifts when something beneath it gives. Signed what? Clara said. The boy shook his head. Mr. Pruitt says come. He says Thomas has a statement now. A signed witness statement that says... He hesitated. Say it, Clara said. That says you told Thomas before you got the deed that you'd put his name back on it later. That it was only temporary. That you promised him. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara stood on her porch in the dying summer light and felt the case she'd spent 3 weeks building creak and shudder under her feet like that north fence before she'd replaced the posts. A signed statement from an eyewitness. Thomas's version of events, notarized and dated. Rutherford would use it to turn her documentation into a question mark. Yes, she kept records. But was she keeping them to hide what she'd promised? She turned back inside. She picked up her bag. She picked up her ledger and her deed and Thomas's original note, and she put them all together with the precise movements of a woman who is channeling something very large and very dangerous into something very controlled. I'm coming with you, Kieran said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at him. She thought about what she'd said to Margaret. I don't know how to let people help. She thought about what Margaret had said back. That's something Thomas put in you. She looked at Kieran Thompson standing in her kitchen doorway, hat in hand, steady as the posts she'd driven into the ground one by one, and she made a decision. All right, she said. The same 2 words she'd said to Margaret. They came easier this time. Not easy, but easier. And that, she thought as she walked past him through the door into the cooling evening, was what progress felt like. Not a wall coming down all at once. Just a door. Just one door, opening 1 careful inch at a time. But opening. George Pruitt's office had never felt so small. Clara sat across from him with Kieran standing just behind her left shoulder, and she listened to every word Pruitt said with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things she needed to understand completely before she could afford to feel anything about them. Owen Pruitt had signed a statement. 3 paragraphs notarized by a clerk from Rutherford's own office, who had apparently ridden up from Tucson specifically for the purpose, because Rutherford was nothing if not thorough. The statement said that Owen had been present at the dinner table the week Clara and Thomas took possession of the homestead, and that during that dinner, Clara had said, and Owen had apparently remembered this verbatim, which was the first thing that struck Clara as wrong, that putting the deed in her name was a temporary arrangement for tax purposes, and that once the property was established, Thomas's name would be added. Pruitt read it aloud. The words landed in the office like stones dropped into still water. When he finished, Clara said, That conversation never happened. I know, Pruitt said. Owen was at that dinner. He was there. He knows that conversation never happened. Pruitt took off his glasses and set them on the desk and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. Owen came to see me an hour after he signed it, he said. He was not in a good state. He said Thomas had come to him with a story. Said that you'd told Thomas privately outside of Owen's hearing, and that he was simply confirming the general tenor of the evening's conversation, not the specific words. That's not what the statement says, Kieran said from behind Clara. His voice was quiet and flat. No, Pruitt agreed. It is not. He looked at his desk. Thomas told Owen that you were trying to keep him from his fair share. Owen is my brother, is a decent man, but he has a weakness for being told a version of things that casts him as helping someone who's been wronged. Thomas is very good at knowing what weakness to use. Can we discredit it? Clara asked. We can challenge it. There's a difference. Pruitt put his glasses back on. A signed, notarized witness statement from a man with no obvious motive to lie is not nothing. Rutherford will lean on it heavily. He'll tell the judge that even your own lawyer's brother remembers the original arrangement being temporary. He looked at Clara directly. It changes our position, not fatally, but meaningfully. The office went quiet. Clara pressed her hands flat on her knees under the desk where no one could see. She breathed in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts, the way her mother had taught her when the world got loud. What do we need? She asked. Something that directly contradicts Owen's account. Another witness from that dinner, ideally. A document from that time period that suggests no such conversation occurred. Or, Pruitt hesitated. Something that demonstrates that Thomas's version of events is a pattern. That he does this. That there's a history of him shaping stories to serve himself. A silence. And then Kieran said from behind her, Mabel Cross. Clara turned and looked at him. What? Thomas's first property deal. Kieran's voice was measured, careful. Before you and Thomas came to Copper Creek, he had a land arrangement in Prescott, with a woman named Mabel Cross. It went wrong, she ended up with nothing, and he walked away clean. I heard it from a man who worked the adjacent property. He looked at Pruitt. If Thomas has done this before, if there's a history of him making verbal agreements with women and then contesting them, Pruitt was already sitting forward. Pattern evidence. Prior conduct. He looked at Kieran. How reliable is your source? Reliable enough that I believed him. I don't know if there are documents. If there are documents, or if Mabel Cross is alive and findable and willing to talk, that changes this entire argument. Pruitt stood up. He moved to the door and called down the stairs to his clerk. James, I need you to send a telegraph to the land registry in Prescott. Tonight, if the office is still open. He turned back. How long ago was this Prescott arrangement? 8-9 years, Kieran said. Records would still exist. Pruitt looked at Clara. We have 2 weeks before the hearing. If this Mabel Cross is findable. Find her, Clara said. She and Kieran rode back to the homestead in the dark without speaking much. The horses found the road by habit, and the night was the particular deep blue of an Arizona summer after 10 o'clock, warm and enormous overhead. She was thinking about Mabel Cross, a woman she'd never met whose name she'd never heard, who might have sat across from Thomas Cooper at her own table 7 years ago, and heard the same careful, reasonable voice explaining why a temporary arrangement was actually in her best interest. She felt something for this woman she couldn't name. Something between grief and solidarity and fury. How did you know about Prescott? She asked. Man named Aldous Webb worked the land next to Mabel Cross's property for 2 seasons. He came through Copper Creek about 3 years back looking for work. We talked a fair amount. Kieran kept his eyes on the road. He didn't like what he saw happen to her. He talked about it. And you remembered. I remember things that matter. Clara looked at him in the dark. How did you know it would matter? He was quiet for a moment. I didn't, he said. Not until Thomas came back. She looked forward again. The homestead was coming up on the left, the shape of the barn against the dark sky. The horses slowed without being asked. Kieran? She said his name the way she'd said it in the barn, deliberate and clear. If we find Mabel Cross, if the Prescott records exist and Pruitt can use them, and if we win this hearing, when, he said. When? She allowed it. I want you to know that I understand what you've done, what you've put into this, your time, your testimony, the Prescott lead. She looked at him. I want you to know I see it. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked forward. I know you see it, he said. That's not why I did it. I know. Another silence. The horses stopped at the barn gate. "Go get some sleep," he said. "You've got a fight ahead of you and you're going to need to be sharp." "I'm always sharp," she said. "I know that too." And this time he did smile, a small, real thing, not performed, not positioned. Just a smile in the dark between two people who were beginning carefully and slowly to trust the ground between them. The telegraph response from Prescott came in 36 hours. Pruitt sent his clerk to the homestead with the news rather than wait for Clara to come into town, which told her something about its importance. She read the clerk's summary note, standing in her kitchen, and then sat down at the table. Mabel Cross was alive. She was 61 years old and living in Prescott, where she had rebuilt after losing her land in a property dispute with Thomas Cooper, then operating under his birth name Thomas Keene 9 years prior. The dispute had gone to a local magistrate. Mabel had lost. The magistrate's notes still on file at the Prescott Land Registry included a description of Thomas's argument that a verbal agreement had been made prior to the formal deed arrangement, that the deed represented only a temporary transfer of liability, and that the verbal promise superseded the written document. Almost word for word the same argument Rutherford was now making. Clara set the paper down on her table and pressed her hands flat against it and breathed. He had done it before. He had sat across from another woman in another town and he had used the same story. He had taken her land. He had walked away clean. And he had come to Copper Creek and found Clara and done it again, or tried to at any rate. The fury that moved through her was cold and clean like water from a deep well. Not the explosive kind of anger, the kind that settles in and stays. She thought about Mabel Cross losing her property. Starting over at 50-something with nothing but whatever she'd managed to salvage and whatever will she had left. She thought about Thomas Cooper riding away from that too, dusting himself off and moving on to the next town and the next woman and the next arrangement. She picked up the paper and went to town. Pruitt's face when she walked in told her he'd already received his own copy. "I've written to Mabel Cross directly," he said before Clara could speak. "I've asked if she'd be willing to submit an affidavit or ideally appear at the hearing. Her testimony about Thomas using an identical argument in Prescott would be significant. It would move this from a property dispute to a demonstration of deliberate fraudulent pattern." "Will she come?" Pruitt sat back. "I don't know. She has no legal obligation to. She's an old woman who went through something terrible once and may have no desire to revisit it." He looked at Clara. "You could write to her yourself, one woman to another. That might carry more weight than a lawyer's letter." Clara looked at him. "Give me paper." He gave her paper. She sat at the corner of his desk, and she wrote to Mabel Cross. She wrote it the way she'd written the list in her ledger, plainly without performance, without decoration. She said who she was. She said what Thomas had done. She said what he was trying to do now. She said that she had documentation and a lawyer and witnesses, and that she believed she could win, but that the signed statement from Owen Pruitt was a weight on the scale, and that if Mabel's experience in Prescott could be placed on the other side of that scale, it might make the difference. She wrote, "I'm not asking you to relive something painful for my sake. I'm asking you to consider whether the woman he might do this to next deserves the same chance you and I both deserved and didn't always get." She folded the letter and gave it to Pruitt to send. Then she walked out of his office and directly into Thomas Cooper on the stairs. He was coming up. She was going down. They met on the narrow landing between floors, with no room to maneuver and no possibility of pretending the encounter was accidental. Thomas looked at the door to Pruitt's office, then at Clara. A calculation moved through his face. "You know about Prescott," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara saw the moment he decided to stop pretending something in his eyes shifted that careful ease dropping away. "Yes," she said. He leaned against the stair rail. "Mabel Cross tried the same thing you're trying," he said. "It didn't work for her." "She didn't have the documentation I have," Clara said. "No." He looked at her with something she could only describe as reluctant recognition. "You always were the more careful one. And you always assumed careful meant controllable." The words landed. She watched them land. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Clara." His voice dropped into something she recognized as his last resort register, not threatening, not charming, something in between. Something that had worked on her more than once in 7 years of marriage. We could still settle this, before Tucson, before it becomes something neither of us can walk back from. You made it something we can't walk back from when you had an old man sign a statement about a conversation that never happened, Clara said. You made it something we can't walk back from in Prescott 9 years ago. She looked at him steadily. Step aside, Thomas. He didn't move immediately. For 3 seconds he stood on that landing and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he stepped aside. She walked past him down the stairs and out into the summer heat. Her hands were shaking. She put them in her pockets and kept walking. The letter from Mabel Cross arrived 6 days before the hearing. It was 2 pages written in a careful hand that had been schooled somewhere and never forgotten it. Mabel Cross wrote as a woman who had thought about what she wanted to say for a long time before she started, which is to say, she wrote with the precision of someone who had been waiting for the chance. She confirmed everything. She described Thomas's argument in Prescott in language that mapped almost exactly to what Rutherford had filed. She described the magistrate's ruling and what she had lost and what the months after had looked like. She said she had spent 9 years occasionally wondering if he'd done it to someone else. The last line of the letter said, "I will be in Tucson. I'll bring what documents I kept." Clara read that last line 4 times. She was sitting at her kitchen table when she read it. The morning light was coming through the window, and the land outside was quiet, and the coffee was going cold beside her because she'd forgotten to drink it. She sat with Mabel Cross's letter, and she breathed very carefully for a while. Kieran knocked at the open door. She'd told him yesterday that the letter might come today, and he'd apparently arranged to be nearby in the way he arranged things without announcement, without demanding acknowledgement. "She's coming," Clara said. He came inside and she handed him the letter. He read it standing. When he got to the last line, he set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment, and when he looked up at Clara, his expression was the same steady thing it always was, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. "It's enough," he said. "I think so. It's more than enough." He sat down across from her. Thomas's entire argument depends on the judge believing that a verbal agreement can supersede a written deed. Rutherford has made that case before it's won before in the right courtroom. But if Mabel Cross walks in and says he made the same argument with her 9 years ago to take land from another woman using identical language, he shook his head. A judge would have to actively choose to ignore it. Judges have actively ignored things before, Clara said. Not in front of this kind of evidence. He looked at her across the table. You built this, Clara. You documented everything from the beginning. You found Mabel Cross. You wrote to her in a way that made her trust you enough to come. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. This is yours. Every piece of it. She looked at him. You found Mabel Cross, she said. You remembered Aldous Webb and Prescott. I handed you a name, he said. You did everything else. The kitchen was quiet between them. Outside, something a bird maybe sang once and went quiet. Clara looked at this man across her table, and she felt the ground shift again, but differently this time. Not the frightening kind of shift, not the something is giving way kind. The other kind. The kind that means something is settling, something is finding its level. After Tucson, she said. He went still. Yes. She looked at her hands on the table, and then back at him. After Tucson, when this is done, I'd like to have a conversation, a different kind. She kept her voice even. About what comes next. Kieran was very quiet for a moment. What kind of next? I don't know exactly, she said honestly. I know I'm not ready to know yet. But I think... She paused, found the words. I think there might be something worth thinking about, between us. He didn't rush to answer. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. He sat across from her, and he thought about it in his honest, visible way, like a man who didn't see any advantage in pretending to feel less than he felt. I've thought about it, he said. For a while now. I know, she said. And, she almost smiled. After Tucson. He nodded. Once. After Tucson, he agreed. The day before they left for the hearing, Thomas made one final move. Clara was at the general store. Walt Harding had quietly reversed his position over the preceding weeks, the way people do when they sense the wind has changed, when she overheard two men talking near the back. She didn't know their names. They weren't from Copper Creek. They had the look of men who'd been sent somewhere to do something and were discussing the particulars without concern for being overheard, because they didn't know who she was. One of them said Thomas's name. The other said something about the land deed. The first one said, "He wants it before the hearing. If the deed goes missing before she gets to Tucson." Clara set down what she was holding and walked directly to where the men were standing. They looked up. She looked at them. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly, "and I don't need to. But I want you to know that the original deed is not at my property and has not been there for 2 weeks. It is in George Pruitt's office safe, and I have already had this conversation with the county sheriff, who knows Thomas Cooper's name and Garfield Rutherford's name, and both of yours now by description." She looked at each of them once. "Have a good afternoon." She walked out of the store. On the boardwalk outside, she stopped and pressed one hand against the wall and breathed. Her heart was going fast. That had been either very smart or very reckless, and she wasn't entirely sure which. Margaret appeared at her elbow, as if summoned from thin air. "I saw those men ride in this morning," she said. "I recognized the one on the left from Tucson. He works for Rutherford." Her voice was clipped and certain. "I've already sent a note to the sheriff." Clara looked at her. "You were watching." "I've been watching," Margaret said simply. "That's what people who are on your side do." Clara felt it again, that thing in the back of her throat she kept having to swallow. She was getting better at it. Or worse, depending on how you looked at it. Worse at holding herself away from the people who meant to stand beside her. "Margaret," she said. Thank you." She said it plain, without decoration, the way Kieran said things. "For all of it. From the beginning." Margaret looked at her with the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know the value of what was being said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Win first." Clara straightened. She put her shoulders back. She thought about Mabel Cross on a stage to Tucson carrying 9-year-old documents. She thought about Pruitt with her ledger and her receipts. She thought about Kieran Thompson, patient and steady, telling her, when not if. She thought about the list she'd made in her kitchen the night Thomas left. What I have. What I'm going to do. She had done it, every single line of it. Tomorrow she would get on a stage to Tucson, and she would walk into a courtroom, and she would make Thomas Cooper and Garfield Rutherford face everything they had tried to take from her piece by piece, starting with her name on a deed that was rightfully hers. She had been left with nothing but a piece of paper and $47 and 2 hands. She had built an entire case out of it. She was ready. The stage to Tucson left Copper Creek at 6 in the morning. Clara was at the depot by 5:30, with her bag, her ledger, her documents, and Margaret Hale standing beside her, like a woman who had decided she was going whether anyone invited her or not. Margaret had packed for 2 days, which Clara thought was either optimistic or practical, depending on how the morning went. Pruitt was already there, talking quietly with his clerk. Hector Vargas, the man who had helped dig the well. The man whose work receipts lived in Clara's ledger, was there hat in hand, looking like a man who had made a firm decision that cost him something and had no regrets about it. Kieran was the last to arrive. He came down the road on horseback as the sun was just beginning to put color into the eastern sky, rode up to where Clara stood, and swung down without theatrical announcement. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Me neither." He tied his horse to the post. "Let's go win something." She almost smiled. Almost. Thomas was not at this depot. She'd half expected him to be some final gesture, some last attempt at rattling her. But he wasn't there, and the absence told her something. A man who is confident in his position doesn't feel the need to rattle anyone. The fact that Thomas wasn't there meant either he was very confident or he was regrouping. Neither possibility was entirely comfortable. The stage was crowded 6 passengers, including Clara's group, and the road to Tucson was 4 hours of hard, dry miles in summer heat. Clara spent the first hour reviewing her documents. The second hour she put the documents away and looked out the window at the land moving past and let herself be still. The third hour, Mabel Cross's letter was in her hand without her quite knowing how it got there. Mabel Cross was on a separate stage coming up from Prescott. Pruitt had arranged for them to meet at his colleague's office in Tucson the evening before the hearing. Clara had never met her. She had built an entire legal strategy around a woman she only knew from 2 pages of precise, careful handwriting, and she found sitting in that coach with the miles going under her that she was more nervous about meeting Mabel than she was about the judge. Mabel Cross was a small woman with white hair and the particular bearing of someone who had been knocked down hard and gotten up deliberately. She was sitting in the Tucson lawyer's office when Clara walked in, and she stood when she saw her, and the 2 women looked at each other across the room for a moment that had weight in it. "Miss Keene," Mabel said. "Mrs. Cross." Clara crossed the room and took her hand. "Thank you for coming. I know what it cost you to be here." Mabel Cross looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "I think so." "No." Not unkindly. "You'll know what it costs in about 10 years when someone asks you to go back and do it all again in front of a judge." She sat back down, and something in her face settled. "But that's all right. You don't need to know that yet." She looked at Pruitt. "Tell me what you need from me." Pruitt laid it out. Clara watched Mabel Cross absorb the shape of the case with the focused attention of a woman who had been in a courtroom before and understood that attention was currency. When Pruitt got to the part about Owen Pruitt's signed statement, Mabel's expression tightened. "A witness statement about a conversation that didn't happen," she said. "Yes." Mabel looked at her hands. "He did it to me with a neighbor, a man named Garrett, who owed Thomas money and paid it in testimony." She looked up. "I could never prove it then. I just need you to know it's the same playbook. Exactly the same." Clara said, "I believe you." Mabel Cross looked at her for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite relief, but the specific softening that comes when a person who has been dismissed for a long time is finally told that what they know is true. "All right," Mabel said. "Let's take him apart." The courtroom in Tucson smelled like old wood and authority. Clara had been in courtrooms before twice for minor property matters that Thomas had handled while she stood beside him, looking agreeable. She had never been in one as the primary party, the one whose name was on the paperwork, the one the judge would address directly. She took her seat beside Pruitt, and she looked at the room with clear eyes, and she breathed. Thomas was across the aisle with Rutherford. Thomas was in his best suit. Rutherford was a lean man in his 50s with silver hair and the practiced ease of someone who had been performing competence for 30 years. He didn't look at Clara when she came in. That was a choice she noted, a deliberate signal of indifference. She noted it and set it aside. The judge was a man named Caldwell, compact and gray-haired, with the air of someone who had sorted through more human dishonesty than he cared to, and had arrived at a temperament of compressed, efficient patience. He read the filings before the hearing opened with the focused speed of a man who reads for substance rather than performance. When he looked up, he looked at Clara first, not at Rutherford, not at Thomas, at Clara. "Miss Keene," he said, "you hold the original deed to the property in question." "Yes, Your Honor." "And it bears both parties' signatures and proper notarization." "Yes, Your Honor." "And your position is that the deed represents the entirety of the agreement between yourself and the respondent, with no verbal addendum." "That is correct." He nodded once. He looked at Rutherford. "Mr. Rutherford, proceed." Rutherford was good. Clara had known he would be, and she'd prepared for it anyway. But sitting in that courtroom and watching him work was something else. He moved through his argument with the ease of a man laying down cards he knew were strong. The amended fraud claimed the deed as temporary arrangement, the verbal promise. His language was precise and carefully humble, the language of a man who wants to appear to be simply presenting facts rather than building a story. Then he called Owen Pruitt. Owen looked terrible. He was pale and would not look at his brother across the room and would not look at Clara, and directed his eyes at a point approximately 6 inches above the judge's head. He confirmed the statement he'd signed. He said yes, he'd been at the dinner. He said yes, he recalled a general conversation about the deed arrangement being potentially temporary. Pruitt cross-examined him for 11 minutes. It was the most precise 11 minutes Clara had ever sat through. Pruitt did not attack his brother. He simply asked questions, specific, dated, documented questions. He asked Owen what the weather had been that evening. Owen didn't remember. He asked what they'd had for dinner. Owen didn't remember. He asked what time the conversation had allegedly occurred. Owen didn't remember. He asked who else had been in the room at the moment of the alleged promise. Owen said he thought he wasn't certain. He thought perhaps Clara and Thomas had been alone in the kitchen briefly. Pruitt let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "So the conversation you signed a statement about, you didn't actually hear it." Owen went still. "You signed a statement confirming a conversation that by your own account occurred in a room you were not in." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Owen said, "Thomas told me." "Mr. Pruitt," the judge said in a voice like a door closing, "the statement is based on hearsay from the respondent himself." Rutherford was on his feet immediately. The argument that followed was technical and fast, and Clara followed enough of it to understand that Rutherford was trying to reframe the statement as corroborative rather than primary evidence. Caldwell listened with his hands flat on the bench. When Rutherford finished, Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. "The statement is admitted as character evidence only," Caldwell said, "not as direct testimony of the alleged verbal agreement. Continue, Mr. Rutherford." Rutherford sat down. He was not visibly rattled. Men like Rutherford trained the rattle out of themselves. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted very slightly. Across the aisle, Thomas was looking at his hands. Pruitt called Hector Vargas, who testified in quiet, precise English about every day he had worked on Clara's property, the dates, the wages, the nature of the work. He produced his own receipts. He said he had never once seen Thomas Cooper performing physical labor on the property. Not once in 2 seasons. Rutherford cross-examined him for 6 minutes and got nothing useful. Pruitt called Kieran Thompson. Kieran walked to the stand with the unhurried gait of a man who was constitutionally incapable of performing anything, which was, Clara realized, watching him, exactly the right quality for a witness in a courtroom. He sat down, and he looked at the judge, and he answered every question Pruitt asked him, with the straightforward economy of someone stating observable facts. He had ridden past Clara's property near every morning for 2 years. He had observed her working the land before sunrise on numerous occasions. He had never observed Thomas Cooper engaged in physical improvement of the property. He had been present in the feed store when Thomas returned to Copper Creek and had observed Thomas's demeanor and statements, which he described without embellishment. Rutherford cross-examined him. He tried the same angle Thomas had tried on the road, the implication of Thompson's presence at the property, the suggestion of impropriety. Kieran looked at Rutherford with a steady patience that was somehow more devastating than any sharp answer could have been. "I brought wire," he said, "and lumber, and I spoke to Miss Keene on a few occasions. If that constitutes something improper in your estimation, I'm not sure what to tell you." A sound moved through the courtroom. Not a laugh too restrained for a laugh, but something. Caldwell looked at Rutherford. Rutherford sat down. Then Pruitt called Mabel Cross. The courtroom changed when Mabel walked to the stand. Clara felt it, that particular quality of attention that happens when a room collectively recognizes that something important is about to be said. Mabel settled into the chair with the composure of a woman who had been waiting 9 years to be in exactly this position and was not going to waste it. Rutherford was on his feet before Pruitt finished the first question. The argument that followed was the sharpest of the morning. Rutherford objected to the relevance of prior conduct to the admission of evidence from a separate jurisdiction, to the characterization of pattern behavior from a single prior case. Caldwell heard every objection and ruled on each one with the compressed efficiency of his nature. He allowed Mabel Cross to testify. She spoke for 22 minutes. She described the Prescott arrangement in exact, documented detail. She described Thomas's argument almost verbatim, almost identically phrased to what Rutherford had filed in Clara's case. She described the magistrate's ruling and what she had lost. She produced 3 documents she had kept for 9 years, creased from folding and refolding, but legible, clearly dated. She was precise, she was calm, and she was absolutely devastatingly credible. When she finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Rutherford's cross-examination lasted 4 minutes. There was nothing there for him, and he was too experienced to pretend otherwise. He sat down. Clara looked at Thomas across the aisle. Thomas was looking at Mabel Cross. His face had gone through several things during her testimony, and had landed on something Clara recognized, the specific private expression of a man who has finally been fully seen. Not just challenged, seen. The particular fear of a person whose pattern has been named in public in front of a judge by a woman he thought had been neutralized by time and distance. Clara looked at him until he looked back at her. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to face the front. Caldwell called a 30-minute recess. Clara sat in the hallway with Pruitt and Kieran and Margaret, who had found her way into the courthouse and into a seat in the gallery, with the determination of a woman who had decided this was her business too, and nobody said much. Pruitt reviewed his notes. Kieran sat beside Clara with his forearms on his knees and said nothing, which was exactly what she needed. Margaret brought coffee from somewhere. Clara drank it without tasting it. "How do you think it's going?" she asked Pruitt. Pruitt was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man choosing between honesty and reassurance, and landing firmly on honesty. "Better than I expected when the week started," he said. The Mabel Cross testimony was significant. Caldwell is a careful man. He doesn't like patterns of conduct that suggest deliberate fraud. But she heard the but. But Rutherford will argue in closing that pattern evidence from a prior case shouldn't determine the outcome of this one, that whatever happened in Prescott is irrelevant to the specific facts here. He looked at her. It will come down to how much weight Caldwell gives to that argument versus how much weight he gives to the documentation and the testimony. Clara nodded. "Okay," she said. "That's it. Okay. I've done everything I can do," she said. "Everything. There's nothing left that I haven't done. Whatever he decides, I know that." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "You have." Caldwell's closing was sharp and unhesitating in the way of a man who had made his decision during the recess, and was now expressing it with appropriate judicial weight. He addressed the deed first. The deed was clear, properly executed and notarized. The respondent's signature was present and uncoerced. The respondent himself had confirmed in earlier proceedings that he had signed the document voluntarily. The respondent's argument that a verbal agreement superseded the written deed was, in Caldwell's view, unsupported by any evidence other than a witness statement that had proven under cross-examination to be second-hand at best. He addressed the pattern evidence. He said with careful precision that while the Prescott case was a separate matter, and he was not ruling on it, the existence of an almost identical argument made by the same party in a prior property dispute was relevant to the question of credibility and deliberate intent. He addressed the fraud allegation. He said the evidence presented by the petitioner, the documented independent expenditures, the testimony of independent witnesses, the unimpeached deed did not support the conclusion that the deed arrangement had been obtained through misrepresentation. Then he looked up from his notes and he said, "The deed stands. The property belongs to Miss Clara Keene in its entirety without condition. The respondent's claim is dismissed." Clara heard it. She heard each word individually, and then she heard them together, and she sat very still for a moment while the courtroom moved around her. Pruitt's hand coming down on the table. Once in quiet satisfaction, Margaret's sharp exhale from the gallery. The sound of Rutherford speaking low and quickly to Thomas. She looked at Thomas. He was looking straight ahead. His face was closed in the way of a man who has lost something and is deciding in real time how to be the kind of person who doesn't show it. She recognized the effort. She had made that effort herself in a different direction on a different day. She felt no satisfaction in watching him make it. She felt nothing about him at all, she realized. Not anger, not grief, not the bruised tenderness of recent loss. Nothing. He was a man she had once known who had done something deliberate and harmful and had been stopped. That was the entirety of what he was to her now. A closed chapter in a book she was still writing. She turned away from him. Mabel Cross was waiting in the corridor when Clara came out. Clara walked straight to her and took both her hands and held them. "Thank you," Clara said. The words were inadequate, and she knew it and said them anyway. Mabel looked at her with those clear, settled eyes. "Did you win?" she asked. "We won." Mabel nodded once. Her hands tightened briefly around Clara's and then released. "Good," she said. Simply. Just that. Good. The word of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. They stood together in the hallway for a moment, two women who had never met before that week, who were bound by the specific thread of having been underestimated by the same man and having refused to accommodate that underestimation. "What will you do now?" Clara asked. Mabel Cross almost smiled. "Go home," she said. "Plant the garden I've been putting off. Live my life." She looked at Clara with something that might have been amusement. "What will you do?" Clara thought about the homestead. The 40 acres, the repaired fence line, and the winter wheat coming in, and the 2 horses, and the lumber Kieran had brought that still needed to become a wall before winter. She thought about the ledger at home, with its 2 pages, what I have, what I'm going to do, and all the lines she'd filled in. "Go home," Clara said, "and build something." The stage back to Copper Creek left the next morning. Kieran had his horse and rode alongside for the first stretch of the road, which he said was because he needed to go in that direction anyway, and which nobody believed and nobody needed to. The morning was already warm, and the sky was the deep ceramic blue that the territory did in high summer, and the land ran out flat and wide in every direction, the way it did, merciless and beautiful and indifferent in the way that only very large things can afford to be. Clara sat in the stage with Margaret asleep against the window beside her, and Pruitt reading across from her. And she looked out at the land and she thought. She thought about the woman she had been on the day Thomas left standing in the yard with 2 documents and $47, watching a man ride away with someone else, and feeling the town close around her like a fist. She thought about that woman walking into Harding's store, and the bank, and the seamstress shop, and hearing "no, no, no," in the careful language people use when they want to refuse you without taking responsibility for the refusal. She thought about sitting at the water trough in the strip of shade, giving herself 5 minutes. She thought about everything she had built in the weeks after those 5 minutes. Not just the legal case, though she was proud of that. She was allowed to be proud of that. But the other things. The way she had learned in spite of everything Thomas had done to make it harder to turn her hand over under Margaret's and hold on. To say all right when Kieran offered to come with her. To write to Mabel Cross and trust that one woman's honest words could reach another. She thought about what her mother used to say. The worst thing that could happen to a woman wasn't hardship. It was letting hardship convince her she was less than what she was. Thomas had tried very hard to convince her of exactly that. He had tried in 7 years of marriage, and in the careful poisoning of a town, and in the construction of a legal argument designed to take the one solid thing she had left. He had tried with every tool he had. She had not been convinced. Copper Creek came up on the horizon at midday. The familiar geometry of its main street, the water tower, the spire of the church on the hill. Clara watched it come toward her through the stage window and felt something settle in her chest. Not the triumphant version of homecoming, something quieter. The feeling of a place that is yours because you have chosen it and worked it and stayed when leaving would have been easier. When the stage pulled in, half the town seemed to be at the depot. Margaret characteristically had gotten word ahead somehow. Clara stepped out of the stage and found herself looking at faces she recognized: Pete Dunmore from the feed store, Doris Pratt, with her hands clasped together, looking somewhere between guilty and relieved. Hector Vargas, who had ridden back a different way and arrived first, and a collection of women she recognized from the community who had apparently decided that this occasion warranted being present for. Walt Harding was there. He met her eyes and looked away and then looked back. "Miss Keene," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Walt," she said, and left it at that. That was enough. Kieran rode up and dismounted as Clara stepped onto the boardwalk. He stood at the edge of the small crowd and waited until the noise and the greetings had moved through their natural arc, and then the crowd settled and it was just him and her in the particular way that people give space to two people who clearly have something to say to each other. She walked over to him. "You said after Tucson," he said. "I did." "It's after Tucson." She looked at him, at the familiar steadiness of him, at the face she had been reading for weeks now, learning it the way you learn land, feature by feature, until you can find your way across it in the dark. She thought about all the things he had not done. He had not pushed, he had not performed, he had not used her need against her, or made his help contingent on her gratitude. He had simply been there in the particular way of a man who understood that presence is sometimes the whole of the gift. "I want to take it slow," she said. "I know." "I mean it, Kieran. I'm not ready to trust easy. I may never be entirely ready. What Thomas did to my ability to trust people—" "Clara." He said her name the way she said his, deliberate, clear. "I've been getting up every morning for 2 years and riding past your fence line on my way into town. I'm not in any kind of hurry." She looked at him for a moment. "That's either very patient or very stubborn," she said. "Probably some of both," he said. She almost laughed. Almost. "All right," she said. Those 2 words again. The 2 words that had started as the hardest thing she could say and had become over these weeks something else, not easy but familiar. The words that opened doors. He reached out and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair back from her face with 2 fingers. A small gesture, careful and deliberate. She didn't flinch. She looked at him and she let herself feel the ground under her feet. Her ground 40 acres, with her name on a deed in her bag, and she did not move away. "Come to dinner Thursday," she said. "We'll start there." He smiled. The real one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She walked home that afternoon alone, which was how she'd wanted it, one last walk down the creek road by herself. Just her and the land and the summer air and the particular quality of late afternoon light in the territory that turned everything the color of old gold. She walked every inch of the homestead when she got there. The fence line she'd repaired post by post. The garden that had needed harvesting. The barn with its new lumber waiting to become a wall. The house with its kitchen table where she had sat with a pencil and written 2 lists that had become the architecture of everything that followed. She went inside. She sat down. She opened the ledger to the 2nd page. "What I'm going to do," and she looked at every line she'd written in the dark on the night after Thomas left. Every single line had a tick mark next to it. She turned to a fresh page. She picked up her pencil. She wrote at the top, "What I'm going to build next." And she began. A woman's worth is not given to her by the man who leaves, or the town that turns away, or the lawyer who tells her the odds are against her. It is not assigned by circumstance, or stolen by cruelty, or determined by how much she is left with when the dust settles. It is built line by line, post by post, day by day, by her own hands, in her own time, on her own ground. Clara Keene had learned this the hard way, the only way that truly sticks, and she carried it now like the deed in her pocket. Something solid, something proven, something that belonged entirely and irrevocably to her.